I think what happened to Geelong confronting two really poor finals performances interspersed with an OK one, but lots of questions now confronting Chris Scott, confronting the new CEO. I think Lee Matthews said during the week they have to ask themselves the question, is Chris Scott the coach for the long term? And they need to work out where they're going and how they're going to get there.
Yeah, they do. Lots of questions to be answered down at Geelong. We knew the fallout for whichever side lost that game, be it Melbourne under the pressure that they were under, or Geelong. Different fallout, obviously, considering the demographic of Geelong. I mean, it's amazing that we're sitting here after the so-called purest weekend of footy. We're talking about two sides that failed to deliver on the one fundamental that underpins everything, and that's just actually giving effort. And it was there early for Geelong as well. I know we've spoken about well, we haven't, but the illness alibi has been put out there. This is 10 seconds into the game, guys. So the ball's gone over Gary Rowan's head. That can happen. But then you might want to follow through the most dangerous rebounding halfback for Melbourne, not give him a 40-metre leg rope. This is all the first play of the game. Then you've got an opportunity, 3 Geelong players to execute a tackle or lay some pressure. Doesn't happen, stepped. And that set the scene. A 5-metre trail in for Blitzarves for the rest of the night. And it really just continued on. I mean, heads in the game stuff. This is a minute 20 into the game for Geelong. Zach Toohey was standing side by side with Cozzy Pickett and for some reason just completely abdicated any sort of defensive responsibility, and then Zach Guthrie the same. So, yep, illness is an alibi, but the signs were there right from the start that the Cats didn't show up.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, look, both games are very similar, weren't they? They over a quarter time. There's a lot of space there, really, in the forward, in your defensive 50. I know they play a zone off defence, but you've got to understand the pressure or lack of pressure upfield as defenders. You have to read the situation of the game, don't you? And then put heat on the back of your opponent, who is the forward. This is a demolition. I've never seen a game of football like this. So they conceded 101 points from clearances, which the next best this year from any other team was 44 points. So that was unbelievable. The most conceded by a team in 10 years there. They've got an elite midfield. So that was clearly a problem. They were actually beaten in the clearances. Unbelievable. They're beaten plus by 4 in the clearances. Yep. But when you look at clearances, you need to dig deeper. And our old coach, Lee Matthews, used to say the same thing. We often would get beaten in the clearances, but we had a stat, unpressured or pressured clearances. And have a look at these unpressured clearances from Melbourne. They just walked straight out the front of a lot of centre bounces and around the ground stoppages, and they scored heavily, 101 points. It was unbelievable, and that was a demolition in every sense of the word.
Yeah, they've been exposed in a couple of areas. Melbourne didn't even need their transition game as much as they normally do because of this domination, Gary. Yeah,
they played the wrong team on the wrong night at the wrong stage of where they're at, Geelong. Because all the things where the suspected vulnerability was played itself out, and that was at the clearance and then post the clearance. And this is a team who are right now, as fit and as hard as they've ever been. They've got great runners. They've got great spread from stoppage, and all of a sudden you've got a Geelong side whose midfield has been there. They've been that side that have put others to the sword over a long period of time. But it's just they've just on that night they've come up against the wrong team and you throw the illness stuff in, and I'm not making an excuse, but that doesn't help. That was just. Everything collided, and that's what we saw.
So we'll pay Melbourne due credit, Gaz. Obviously, they were clinical. They were absolutely unbelievable. But do you think, based on the vision that we've seen, that Geelong actually gave themselves a chance to be in the game from an effort point of view?
No, they weren't, and they weren't allowed to, really. I mean, being there, the closing speed, the closing pressure that Melbourne applied to Geelong, and all those pictures are great, and I saw them all live, and you're absolutely 100% right. But they just looked like they'd come to the end of this campaign, and the longer it went, the more exposed they were. And again, I'm not the 6 or 7. I believe that they're crooks, and that wouldn't have helped. But yeah, they were smashed in every aspect. And we'll talk about the Dogs and the positives for Melbourne coming up. Their hardness around the footy, Melbourne, on that night watching it was scary good.
Yeah, it's ferocious. No more harder player than Joel Selwood, and yet once again, I think he was symbolic of an era just about coming to an end. And there's some question marks about how his role needs to change, how Dangerfield's role also needs to change.
Yeah, and Joel was given the role on Oliver, and you can see, I mean, he did as much as he possibly could, Joel, with what he's got left in terms of his physical assets. I mean, he's a warrior, he's tough. This was great. This was great selfless play. Heads in the game stuff from Petrarca. He's like, hey, don't let Selwood follow you around. You go to Menegola, my man. We'll create some confusion. All of a sudden, Selwood's ends up on Petrarca. I mean, he doesn't have the leg speed to be able to go with him. Where do you think he's at, Gaz? Joel, I mean, there's no bigger fans of him than all of us sitting here, and the way he goes about it, and he's a warrior. Where's he at?
Yeah, but this is why we sat here last week and, threw up whether he would go to Oliver. And I reckon Melbourne sat there and going, gee, I hope so. Because we're talking about 34-year-old Joel. And Oliver is where Joel was 10 years ago as one of the best 3 or 4 midfielders, hardest running, gut running. So the father time gets everyone. And Joel tried his guts out. He was as hard again during the night, but his legs just won't take him. And the separation again and the spread. So Oliver and Petrarca are Selwood and Dangerfield 5, 6, 7 years ago. They're at the absolute peak of their physical powers, and Joel just couldn't go.
So in 2010, Chris Scott took over, and he didn't change everything. He just tweaked a little bit. Are they in that position where he needs to tweak Brownie, or is he in a position where, for the betterment of this footy club, he needs to go a bit harder? Where does he take them?
Look, they're committed to this path, no doubt about it, obviously getting Jeremy Cameron in, OK? There is comparisons made from 2010 to the 2011 Premiership.
Yep.
Stark differences, though, in my mind. The problem with the current group, all your talent is in the older part of the group. So in 2010 prelim final, there was 4 under-25s that night. Hawkins, Selwood, Varco and Taylor. 2 of them have already been All-Australians.
And there's a comparison between the two sides.
Absolutely. You look at the players, 6 under-25s played for Geelong on Friday night.
Yep. These
are the names: Holmes, Myers, Henry, Close, Radaglia, Zach Guthrie. All struggling, apart from Henry and maybe Myers, to hold a place in the side. So, for me, that's the concern. What's coming up from underneath? So, yes, he does need to pivot and play some younger blokes and get more game time into those guys. But is the talent there? Is the Selwood there? Is the Harry Taylor there? Is the Tom Hawkins there in that under-25 group? The jury is still out on those names because we haven't seen enough of them outside of maybe Jack Henry.
Rui, if you were going to tweak it and hang in there, as appears to be the case, surely he's got to address the lack of run through that middle of the ground, the back end of the front end run.
Yeah, I think the smashing could be a blessing. I really do in the end, because if you play it out to a 15 or a 20-point loss and you fall into, well, gee, are we still close? Are we still close enough where we can roll it out again and try again and we might get over the top? No, I think it's a big enough reality check to now make meaningful change. Doesn't have to be drastic change, but meaningful change. Whether that's personnel, game style and system, I would imagine a combination of the lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that has to be the epiphany for Chris Scott and the Cats to make
some more run, don't
change.
They need to get some more run. Look at the Bulldogs, Melbourne and Richmond of the last few years. Their style needs to catch up to that.
Gary, Chris Scott, where does he take them?
Yeah, well, I think he also was shell-shocked, as he said after the game. We'll sit down. But the recruiting, and you go back, and they've been as good as anyone in the competition, but then you go back and do what they did. They got Smith, who's been great, and Higgins. Now, then you're sort of obligated to play both those blokes, and that's at the expense of a younger kid getting game time. And now you've gone through another 23-week season where there are players that haven't been able to get game time because you've, lumped on a Sean Higgins, for instance, coming back into this side. So, I think it's a pretty substantial one. They could go to the well again next year with what they've got, with those 30-plussers and 29-plussers, and they are so good and they play so well down in Geelong that they can finish in the top 6 again and compete at this time of the year again. But can they get to where they need to go with that group? And I don't think they can. So that's the decisions they've got to make.
We'll give the 2021 version of the Cats a tick or a cross, Gary.
Yeah, well, the fact is they contend again, don't they? They put themselves in contention again and get themselves into the top 4, which is, I mean, from a Geelong supporter's point of view, they sit back and go, well, that's not a bad place to be. I thought Henry was in the back half, was one of their really keys, and Tom Hawkins continues to play footy that, we're talking about age. He's one that defies age. And then the age demographic is also their problem at the other end of the spectrum. Finals failure again with you. You can dress it up any way you want, but that's staring them in the face. And continuation of what Brownie talked about, So when you're looking at one end and you're going, OK, we're coming to the end of a glorious run, where is it that's coming underneath? Have you got something that's A grade? I can't see an A grader and of the younger variety coming through, and that's as a result of where they've been. We understand that, but that's the issue.